one of the first calls that I had on the ground in there. Um, we got called into a pretty urban area for an RCIED. And I won't go into the details, but we were getting ready to do uh, uh, a, a remote procedure on it. We were clearing the area, and we had IA and IP, Iraqi police, and everything there, and we were clearing the cordon, and I was trying to get everybody out, but I didn't have an interpreter with me, and they kept trying to get my attention, but not in like an obvious way. They kept yelling and pointing at something, and it took me a little bit to pick up on it. And I didn't want to go into the cordon because there wasn't a lot of room. Well, before we did the procedure, we got back. We're like, hey, what's going on here? And they explained to us that there were a box, there was a cardboard box underneath there, and that there were a bunch of puppies that were yelping within the cordon, and they wanted to get it out before we did anything remotely. And so went ahead and they did it and pulled them out. We did our procedures, we did our thing. Nobody got hurt, no damage. That was a win for the day. I'll tell you that 13 years later or something like that, I still carry guilt because I felt like I failed in that instance, not being more open to the communication that was happening around. And knowing my story and how much I care about animals and, dogs and all the animals we have out here, what felt like a failure from that op, now in the long run, 13 years later, feels like a win for the future. And that, to me, is where learning occurred for me on the much broader, grander scale. So that's an example I bring up of maybe trying to reframe something that felt like a perceived failure in the moment, but actually it led to true growth overall.
Yeah, it's.
Go ahead, Bill.
Oh, thanks, Brad. The thing about the perceived failure, and I have a pretty active imagination, and there's things that have happened where, if you dwell on what might have happened, I mean, that can really weigh on you. I mean, I was 16 years old and living in Santa Barbara, California. This friend of mine, she had a really cool like Super Bee charger, right? Mario, you would have dug it, except it wasn't a probe, so no Mazda parts in it. But and she let me borrow it. This lady, she's crazy. She let me, a 16-year-old guy, borrow her charger or Super Bee to go on a date. And so I pick up this girl, and dumbass me, I put the foot down, and this thing just jumps up and runs, right? In a neighborhood, right, on her street. And nothing happened. But as later, when I thought back on it, and I thought, man, if some kid had run out in front of that car, 2 tons of steel, it would have been horrible. Again, nothing happened. I didn't get a ticket, didn't wreck her car, I didn't run over the school bus full of orphans or anything. But that, to this day, still, I think, God, what an idiot. I was dumb. And the potential of disaster and what that would have done to my life, is huge. So, Mario, that resonates with me because I have that I carry around, and clearly It's just something I look back on. It comes up every now and again, especially if there's talk of a road accident where some kids are run over or something. Then that brings it to the forefront, and I worry about it a little bit. But yeah, that's so I think failure in your own mind is definitely something that or the potentialization of failure or something. Maybe I should write a book. That'd be a cool title. Or a t-shirt.
Just make sure there's a lot of pictures in the book, Bill.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think any of us that write a book have to use the word Jew balls, just because Kastner shouldn't be the only one.
So Bill, that brings up a story that I feel like will play into, when you feel at the time like it's a win, but then in the long run you kind of think back and maybe that was a failure, right? And so a scenario comes to mind when it was like my 2010 deployment, so my second to my last combat deployment. And, I've already kind of been operating at a certain level for a certain amount of time to where, that kind of gray area or that line's becoming a very big gray area as to what's good and what's not, right? And so I remember I had this culvert IED that I had to deal with. And we had worked a lot on developing culvert clearing charges. And one of the charges we developed, my buddy used on that same culvert like 2 nights before, but he ran it pretty hot, so it collapsed that side of the culvert. So when I got there to deal with the scene, I didn't have the ability to use any kind of clearing charge, right? Because the one side was completely collapsed. So my options were kind of limited. And, at the time, I remember feeling like I was reasoning through the scenario and, justifying my course of action, which eventually was I stripped down of all my gear and I crawled into this culvert. I mean, that it's one of the small ones. It wasn't one of the bigger ones. And I probably had to scoot in 10 to 15 feet, where I was fully into this thing and tying up to these 2 40-liter jugs to pull them out. And I remember at the time, and it wasn't until I went to go hook up to them that I was like, what am I doing? And then, like you said, just things kind of start playing in your head. And I just started thinking about the physics of what would happen if that went off. And like my head basically shooting out my ass at the other end of this culvert, And for some reason that image is stuck in my head of like my head just shooting out my ass.
Path of least resistance.
And so needless to say, right, got the jugs pulled out and was able to break them apart. And at the end of it, we collapsed the cordon and I grabbed the interpreter and I was like, to the villagers came out that lived in the clots next to the culvert. I was like very, very, with this big sense of ego, right? Like, hey, tell them that their street is safe now and that their property is protected and blah, 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 right? And I'll never forget, like, he told them and then immediately he said, why don't you just blow it up? They're tired of this effing culvert because they just keep putting IDs in it, And I was like, damn, dude, fine, whatever. You're welcome. But, when I look back on it, I feel like that was a moment that I recognize now where, I definitely drifted past, the line. And I feel like looking back, it's like, taking a level of risk that probably shouldn't be taken. And, beat myself up over it a little bit, and really do it in front of anybody else. But, you know what it's like when you get back to the fob and when you go to bed that night and finally wind down and you start kind of thinking through the ops and you're like, oh shit, well, that was kind of a fuck up, and just had to kind of learn to give myself some grace and extract the lesson from it, right? Which is, you know, what out here is actually worth my life and worth that level of risk, and kind of thinking through that. And, you know, and then to get on the military perspective of it, you know, like what is even the intent? You know, would that me doing that like move the needle at all any closer to what we're actually trying to do? You know, so I feel that the learning can be the medicine to that feeling of failure that comes from those lessons or from that experience, right? But
yeah, that's profound, and I really appreciate you describing that. It's we speak and think a lot in EOD, but to be able to translate and articulate the lessons learned, I think in a way that speaks outside of our career field, that's the hard part. And I think you're on the right path with that. I wrote down towards while you were finishing up was success versus failure. And to quote my wife from the last couple days, more than one thing can exist at the same time. So right. we can succeed, or a varying degree of success, at the same time as a varying degree of quote unquote failure. So I think where the big F failure comes in is not following up either with yourself or with your team or with the career field. And okay, this is the decision that happened. Maybe it wasn't the best. Learn from this mistake and not my mistake, because other people have probably made similar mistakes, right? Or quote unquote failures. I know I have too. But communicating those things and owning up to what we're able to helps the next generations come forward and behind us. Because, you know, I don't know if Brad can speak to that, but it's no longer, it stopped being about how proficient we were a while ago, in my humble opinion. It's about how to make the next generation more proficient and more resilient and more capable. That capability, what Bill was talking about before 9/11, the Cold War, is honing the capability. And to bring it back to what we were talking about, I think there's some themes there that can definitely help the younger crew. What do you guys think?
I think that's a challenge. And I've talked about this before. You know, I got to my first EOD shop, Travis Air Force Base, in 1985. There were still some Vietnam vets running around that had actual combat experience, but I knew nothing. It was just not part of the lexicon. The lessons they learned weren't something that we had, and I didn't know of anything. You know, I didn't never even cared to look, right? Because again, you know, we were prepping for the bear to fly over and saturate airfields, and then we were going to go out and do our brat stuff, right? So why did we care about any of that? But and I think we're in a much better place now because of, you know, I mentioned Kastner a minute ago. You know, he's written those books and captured a lot of not necessarily the TTPs, but the, you know, how we felt or how we operated or, you know, how we communicated or whatever, but it's captured, right? And I'm hoping that the lessons that we've learned can get passed on through that. And the us and them thing, and I'm sure, Brad, that it exists, the guys that have combat tours and the guys that don't. And I bet that there's probably a bit of a divide within the active duty shops. What do you think about that?